Hi everyone, my name is Natalie Rackley and this is my reading presentation. This week I was assigned the reading Ebony and Ivy, Enslaved People on Campus. Um, this reading was very dense and historical and included many stories to help the reader kind of form a timeline of sorts to better understand the unfolding of several important key themes that occurred during this era of slavery and what the impacts of slavery during this time period had on higher education. So the chapter begins by discussing the decline of Will Locke's Indian mission. So we're moving from discussing the Native Americans in last week's readings and the Indian mission, and we're moving forward to the rise of slavery. And African slavery thrived in the new college towns, as the author states, and the author goes on to say that human slavery was the precondition for the rise of higher education in the Americas. So I felt like that quote was very powerful. And so the readings this week kind of pointed to four key themes that I pulled, and the first being early leadership and slavery. The second was slavery on campus. The third was violence as an academic matter, and the fourth was lasting legacies. And so these were really big throughout the article, or the chapter actually, that I read, but then also in some of the orienting readings, these were found embedded in there as well. So I felt like these four themes really were weaved throughout all of the readings for this week. So the first theme of early leadership and slavery is discussed at length throughout the readings. The leaders, and so when we're talking about leaders, we're talking about presidents, trustees, and faculty. They all had servants and slaves. The author states that John Sibley, a librarian, said that owning black people was actually a habit of most prosperous men. So that quote and that thought that he had just goes to show how prevalent slavery was during this time period and how it was linked to affluence. And so if you were a prosperous man or a man of status or a family of status, then more than likely during this time period there you had slaves. New presidents of institutions, higher education institutions, they often brought slaves with them, or they would find some soon after their arrival into the town. And so this section of the reading really gives story after story after story of leaders in higher education that illustrates the point that the leaders had great dealings in slavery and how embedded it actually was during this time period. The second key theme that I pulled, slavery on campus. This section discusses how slaves were utilized to carry out functions in order to maintain higher education institutions at this time. And so it talks about how they would clean the students' rooms while they were in classes. They actually helped build the institutions. They did maintenance work, they did groundwork, and so they really helped the campus function. And really, without them, the institutions wouldn't have been successful. And so enslaved people often handled the most labor-intensive tasks. So really those jobs that they had to get down and get their hands dirty. So the jobs that the leaders or other members at the institution, they really didn't care to do. So these were often passed down to the enslaved people. The author points out that access to enslaved people could have been the difference between success and failure for institutions. And so an actual quote says, "The American campus stood out as a silent monument to slavery." And so just the very appearance of the campus seeing how it was maintained. The building actually that was standing there was a silent monument to slavery. I found that quote to be extremely powerful. And as I thought about it, as a silent monument, no words were said. No one had to describe it, just the very presence of the campus um, told the story of slavery during this time period. And so another example that the author gives to illustrate this was actually the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Whenever they were having the cornerstone laying ceremony for this institution, as soon as it was finished, as soon as the huge ceremony was finished, automatically the slaves came on the scene and they began constructing the institution. And so I thought that I could really get a mental picture of that, a huge celebration, ceremony, and then as soon as it ended, seeing those slaves come on and begin building that institution that they really wouldn't get to reap the benefits of at this point. Number 3 was the third theme, actually not number 3, but the third theme was violence as an academic matter. This section and this theme was really hard and difficult for me to read through. I found myself stopping a lot and having to remind myself that this is the history of higher education, the foundation, and so whether it's we have to take the good, bad, and the ugly, and it helps us to grow. And so, as difficult as it was to read, this section discussed the acts of violence and the brutal treatment of slaves by the leaders, faculty, and students on campus. And so I thought that was important, that it not only because one would assume that the leaders were more than likely violent, but actually also the students and their involvement in the acts of violence. So during this time period, it was believed that discipline was necessary in order for slaves to fulfill their duties. And so in one part of the chapter, it actually talks about they need the owner's eye on them to fulfill their duties and complete their responsibilities. And so there was actual physical violence that was committed against slaves, and the more emotional violence, so the breaking up of families for their own personal gain. So it may be that they divided land, and when they divided that land, they divided the families up, and so the families would have to split up and go their separate ways, and so that would take an emotional toll. And then they were also undergoing the physical violence or discipline, as one might say. Okay, and the last thing that I'm going to talk about, although there were many more, these were just the main overarching things that stood out to me. The last one will be lasting legacies. And so really this is the last section in the reading, and it discusses the landmarks that are named for quote unquote forgotten black people or slaves that served during this time. And the author actually goes to say that the landmarks, they serve as a diary of the long, intimate association between the academy and slavery. And so throughout the North, you'll see, or if you read this week's readings already, it discusses several different key players and the landmarks that can be found sprinkled throughout the North to honor their legacy. And so this, I found that to be important this week during the readings, that while they are not celebrated as they should be, there are a few monuments that serve as a reminder. Okay? And so these key themes are vital. So the importance. So why do we care about this? They're vital to understanding how far education has came. So without understanding this not so appealing part of history of higher ed and slavery, it would almost be impossible to appreciate where we are now. I know that I found myself thinking, wow, I can't believe that higher education had such strong and deep roots in slavery. I had never really thought about that or pondered that, before. I've never given it any thought, actually. But it really made me appreciate how far we've came. You know, a lot of times we hear the negative about higher education and access and truly universal access, but it really has came a long way. We're not where we should be, but we're making strides. And so being reflective on the past, so reflection is vital. Being reflective on the past allows us to continue to refine our practices and inform our practices so that we can become the most informed and transformative professionals we can be, which is very important to me. I believe that we can always learn something new. We can continue to grow and change, and so being reflective and informing those practices is vital. Um, and then it also allows us to ask critical and contemporary questions. The article, whether or not I agree with the article, the chapter actually, it appears to be grounded in factual accounts of historical events, so I absolutely agree with it, although I would like to continue to delve more into the history of slavery and its impact on higher education, so learn more about it. I do feel like this article was factual in its claims, and I do agree with Schussler when she says that understanding the history should encourage more contemporary questions. Such question being, what should universities do today to make African Americans feel as though they fully belong? And one way that I would change that question that she posed in her article would be to open it up. So, what should universities do to make all marginalized populations feel as if they fully belong? Which is an important question I feel like we should ask ourselves. So, with that, that leads me to my pressing questions that I'm going to pose to the group. So, one of the articles specifically discusses the Native Americans' ambivalence, so their uneasiness, non-interest towards education. And Schussler points out the tainted history of African Americans in higher education. So, how can we as educators continue to work towards making marginalized populations, whether it be Native Americans, African Americans, women, feel as though they belong? What innovative methods can we use to recognize the history while pushing forward to unity? So we can't completely discount the history. It's very important to understand the history so we can know where we're going. But how can we appreciate and recognize that history but still push forward? So what innovative methods can we use? That's the key part of the question. So something different. And then my second one is Schussler points out that the history and impact of slavery on higher education is only beginning to be uncovered because it's such an uncomfortable topic and because it really points fingers and causes these institutions involved to be accountable for their actions. So the question is, do you think it's important to continue to uncover this troubled past and history? How can learning more about the past help to inform our current and future practices in higher education? So learning more about it, if you do feel like it's important, how can learning more about it, what difference does it make for us? How can we use that information now and in the future? So thanks, and I look forward to reading your responses.